Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Zenitsu, and you're listening to the Digi Talks podcast, the show that covers various topics from news to meta developments and everything in between for the fine folks who love the Digimon trading card game. Just as a quick reminder, I do stream this live over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, as well as it being uploaded as a YouTube video under the channel of Zenitsu, on top of being on various podcasting platforms like Spotify for your viewing and listening pleasure. Please feel free to leave a rating, like, follow, subscribe, review, whatever, depending on the social media platform that you're listening on. It really does help support the podcast. Today, I am back with special guest Mark. Again, he's a designer buddy who we went to college together with and have lots of TCG knowledge. And today, we are going to be talking about the topic of reprints. So, before we get into the actual topic, this is where the meta report is, and, well, it's been a slow week, so we don't actually have any meta reports. The meta is pretty much stable for what it is, and yeah, so on to the question of the week. How often do you think trading cards should reprint specific cards? So I think that's a really good way to kickstart this actual conversation. So, how often do you think TCG cards should be reprinted? Depending on the game, I guess.
Well, I was going to say there's a lot of factors that could factor into like how often cards need to be reprinted, but I think it needs to. It's a variable question, but it should probably be evaluated in terms of like, hey, like how many times has this card been printed? Because I mean, are we talking like commons? Are we talking uncommons? Are we talking like secret rares? You know, some of those high rarity cards, and probably take an evaluation of what the meta is looking like. Because you know, if a card is seeing a lot of use in the meta, and it's like, well, you know, it's been 3 years and this card is in probably 30% of meta decks, but it was only ever printed in set 2 at a, you know, top level rarity. How are these people finding this card? I mean,
Right. Because, like, the idea on the question kind of came up from. I played a lot of Magic, and they've done core sets, and a good portion of core sets are just staple reprint. I guess, like, watered down staple reprints. So, like, obviously, you get your, like, murder and cancel, but you'll obviously have cards that are above that curve, but it at least gives players a baseline to start to work with. And because it was reprinted like literally every single year, those cards were just always in circulation, so it was relatively easy to be able to come in and enter the game and have a good starting point. Because, you know, where do I start? Oh, here's a base set. These are just good staple generic cards on top of a couple of additional cards to flesh out the set. But
right, Matt. No, go ahead and finish your thought.
oh yeah, but I think, like, the big question is, like, what does the company want to reprint? And we're talking about, like, reprint. Like, hey, I need a new version, like, not a new, like, iteration of a card. I need a new copy of the card. Like, give me my fifth version of Murder. Um, just as an example. So right now with Digimon, they have reprinted a lot of cards, but Bandai does reprints weird, and half the time the reprints just functionally don't matter. But I think, like, when cards hit like staple level, that's when they kind of should be in question for constant reprints. Like, bring the value of the card down so that way the accessibility of the card is high.
Well, and on that topic, I mean, a lot of times the company has to basically legally say, you know, they know that the secondary market doesn't actually exist, and oh, well, we can't do reprints because that would affect the price on the secondary market. Da 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 da. Da. But from the company's perspective, reprints are a good thing for the players because, like in my opening allegory, if you have a highly sought after card that has only ever seen print one time at a really high rarity, there's not going to be that many floating around. How are players going to get their hands on this card? And I know Magic, they tend to do a fairly decent job with reprints. You know, like you said in the core sets, those are generally predominantly reprints, and they do have some good quality ones. Like they definitely do some decent reprints in the rare and the mythic slot for some good stuff. Some sets more than others, obviously, but even like in their new mainline sets, they tend to fill in quite a few slots with reprints. Uh, Sometimes it's more just like thematic cards, but they definitely try to get those good just generic staples out to their users. Like you mentioned, cancel. That's a pretty good generic blue. Murder. That's a pretty good generic black card. They just don't want people to be like hounding for these cards. There's an ungodly ample supply of these cards. Nobody should struggle to get them. Obviously, the higher rarity cards, that becomes a little bit more of a challenge. But I will give some credit to Wizards and with Magic that some cards that have needed reprints, they have changed the rarity. So like I've noticed some of the cards used to be in like a rare slot, and I think in one instance I recall a card that was in the mythic slot, and they got bumped down a rarity. So those rares became uncommons. That mythic got bumped down to a rare. When those get reprinted, because they've been bumped down, obviously there's going to be more of them in the set, so it's a lot easier for the players to get their hands on these cards. It'll obviously bring the price down because, the market's going to get flooded with them, which is a big win for the players.
And this kind of like brings into the idea of like where reprints are, because where and when are two huge factors in terms of like actually having a good reprint. Because you could just reprint anything, but is that really gonna be worth the player's while on making that card more accessible? So just as an example with Digimon, we get reprints constantly of cards that just don't matter. So, like, do I really need a reprint of, let's just say, BT8 Lydramon, just as an example? They reprinted that card a couple of times, and that card barely sees any play as is, and when we got the card, it also just didn't functionally matter because nobody was using the card at the time that it got reprinted. So, like, what they choose to reprint and when they choose to reprint it are two varying factors on what would help determine what a good reprint is. Obviously, when people are clamoring for reprints, it's going to be mostly one of two types of cards. Either A, some of the most expensive cards in the game because people are complaining that they're expensive and they want to play with them, or the inverse is cards that they just want to make sure are readily accessible. So, like, we got the memory boosts, just as an example. That was like one of the game's first true instances of a true staple, something that would go into a lot of different decks. So they made sure that when the initial wave was out, it wasn't insanely huge, it was fine, and then they reprinted it again, and they reprinted it again. So, like, we got a couple of different alt art versions of it. There's a couple of ways to be able to get the card, but it's not like it's that hard of a card to get anymore. And they're going to be reprinting the training cards in a similar capacity. I think like their initial release of them was very good idea, just having a promo pack with all 6 of them in, and then the fact that we're getting a starter deck with all 6 of them in is still good at making sure that card's accessible, because the training cards definitely are game warping. Like, that's how good they are, and Bandai knows that, which is why they're reprinting them and making them even more accessible, because right now you'd have to buy a whole booster box of BT14 in order to get those, unless you're just buying the singles, which I would just recommend buying the singles, but, that's just how they were first released. And other games do some really interesting ways on reprinting cards. Magic mostly does in sets because they, for the most part, stopped selling like individual decks outside of commander decks and challenger decks. But those are extra ways to reprint cards in a meaningful way. It's just challenger decks usually came out at the end of the card's life cycle, because that's when, they got the data to decide that that card should be inside of that product, which is not necessarily the greatest thing because rotation is a thing, and then you lose the card almost the second you buy it.
Right. So it all kind of comes down to a question of timing. And if you're running based on the data, I mean, obviously you're always going to be behind because once you have that solid data to go on, like, oh, hey, these cards are definitely seeing a lot of use. And these cards are seeing a lot of use in terms of, Magic, if you're talking standard. Uh, Not anymore, but it used to be standard was only legal for, within the last 2 years, I think it was,
Yeah,
or
2 years, which would have been about 8 or 9 sets.
right. And by then, once you finally get the metrics on, like, oh, hey, these cards are definitely seeing a lot of use, but obviously there's not a very large pool for these cards, and then they try to rectify that problem. Obviously, they're going to be behind the 8 ball on that because they're about to rotate out a standard. That's not to say that perhaps those cards would find, readily good use and success in, say, the modern format. Just because it rotated out a standard doesn't mean it's not viable in some other set. But games like Digimon don't really run into that problem per se because the sets aren't really going out of rotation. It's more just a matter of, is the card still viable in the meta that is currently existing, or is the data too old for these to be relevant anymore?
And that's why we get like really weird card price spikes, is because sometimes there is a card that is old and does see use just because they gave it new support, or it was just currently better than the new support. So it just makes that card more desirable, and then the market basically just gobbles it all up, and now it's starting to get more dry in terms of being able to find the card. And that's usually when we would start crying for a reprint. So, like, just as an example, BT3 Ludamon, which was a special booster 1.0 card, or 1.5 card, my bad, because that card came out towards the beginning of the game's life cycle. Well, we have gotten in EX8, or not EX8, EX6, Ragnarlordmon, and that card's a good card in that deck because it's already supporting the deck better than some of the other alternative options because it's filling a niche that the new cards aren't exactly fulfilling the best. And that's being just a generic searching or digging tool. And nobody's opening up Special Booster 1.5 to dig out for those cards. And Special Booster 1.5 isn't necessarily the most readily available booster box. So that kind of is what leads to cards spiking up in price. But usually Bandai has done an okay job having some good enough foresight to try to be like, okay, this is going to probably need a reprint. We'll just either prematurely release it and then to the players it just feels like it doesn't matter, or we'll release it too late, and again, when we're using the card versus when it gets released, it just makes it doesn't matter. It's not really a no-win situation. It's just a very hard timing to be able to get right. And Digimon's not the only card game to get this basically like reprint reprint equity equation down. Like there's tons of games where they just suck at reprinting cards too, or they reprint cards not necessarily at the greatest of times. So like Force of Will, just as another example, they usually this comes more in common with like legacy supported games where they want to try to reprint more. Because Force of Will turned from a rotation game to a legacy game because nobody was like, that game's already kind of on its last leg as is, but nobody was really trying to chase some of the old stuff, and some of the old stuff was getting really up there, and then they just had a huge big reprint set and it just crashed it all down.
Which, I mean, can tend to happen in those types of games when you do a massive reprint like that. Because, I mean, you have the scarcity driving up the price, but then you have the overabundance, just basic economics. Now, all of a sudden, it's not worth squat because anybody can get their hands on the card.
Right, and
But
that's what's made in Magic like incredibly infuriating, is because you don't know what they're gonna reprint, and all of a sudden you could have like a $50 card turn into a $5 card just because they reprinted the card.
Oh yeah, especially if you're not necessarily collecting the cards to play, but trying to game the market. Like, oh, I get my hands on these cards while they're cheap, and I foresee that the market, these cards are going to go up. Therefore, I'll put them out on the market once they're worth some money, and I'll just pray to God that a reprint doesn't come. But kind of to a point that you already made, you just previously made. Um, I feel like that tends to be a common thing with TCGs is they try to kind of predict cards that they think are going to need reprinting because obviously, they're planning stuff out at least a year, possibly even further in advance on, how they're taking things into account. Yeah, you might be able to argue that they could slip something in last minute just before, they finalize the whole thing. I mean, even potentially if it's urgent enough, they might be able to slide it in after the finalization. Hard to say. Whatever, everything that goes into the process, but I would imagine that they try to kind of do that equity thing where, hey, we think these cards are going to need a reprint, so we're just going to slide them into these, into this slot so that they can see those reprints. And like you said, a lot of times they might make a bad call, and the players are going to look at the reprints and think, "Geez, why'd you guys reprint this? Nobody plays this. This is kind of a useless card. I don't even know why anybody would need this card." But the same line, sometimes they get it right, and it's like, "Oh, hey, they reprinted this card. It was perfect timing. We absolutely needed this because it's absolutely popping off in the meta." But to that same extent, when they're designing the sets, they could kind of weigh the scales on what they think might need reprints as well. If they're in the process of making a set and they're like, oh, hey, we're putting a lot of support into this particular line. Obviously, this line can easily be supported by this card that's from set 4, but maybe not a lot of people have it. We'll just kind of slot it in as, hey, maybe we should, maybe not with the set itself, but sometime around the time this set releases, we'll slot that in for a reprint.
Yeah, and it's Digimon compared to a lot of other games that have like good amount of card pool is really weird because of how Bandai reprints cards. We only have ever had one dedicated reprint set, and that set failed so hard it actually damaged the game, and we're still feeling the ramifications of the damage that set caused. It's not that we weren't asking for the reprints, because they changed the set to accommodate for the reprints more so because of community feedback, which is always good. But in turn, their execution on the set was just so lackluster and piss poor that it damaged it literally damaged the game. And then the funny thing is, because it was a reprint set and everything was foil, it was actually sold higher than normal sets because it was foil and it was labeled as like, this is a premier premium set. Like, this is something special, it's something unique, it's something different. Therefore, it's going to hold a higher price tag on base. Granted, it wasn't much. I think like at the time it was like, technically MSRP was like $5 a pack versus 3 or 450. So it wasn't that big of a change, but like the fact that they are telling stores this is supposed to be a premium product was kind of hilarious considering how bad it was received. I mean, it was mixed received, but in terms of the damage, how bad it damaged the game, because obviously, if anyone's unfamiliar, I have a whole YouTube video on it. But that set originally wasn't supposed to be a reprint set, and we were supposed to get reprints in a dedicated set separately. But no, we asked for it to be together, and that was probably the biggest mistake we've ever made. But Bandai wasn't exactly clear on communicating that. But other games, they do have the luxury on just, here's in Magic's case, here's a commander deck, here's a whole bunch of good reprints, because that's 100 cards that they're printing. Granted, there's lands, so it's realistically about 70 cards that they're printing.
That's pretty generous of you.
Yeah, I know. Most of the time, it's actually around 65. Because their mana bases usually are like close to 40 cards. But granted, some of the lands that they do print for their mana bases are always welcome too. Like, they've done okay job at trying to reprint some of the like mid-tier lands in those types of products, but they've also done the whole secret layer thing where it's just like, here's some unique art and unique visual aesthetic for the card, and we're going to sell singles directly to consumers. I personally hate that, and that's why I also hate Bandai Premium, which is their version of doing that. And it sucks because, I want the cards now and I don't want to wait, but Bandai's just like, no, we need to print the cards. So you're going to wait 6 months in order to get the cards. And by that point, like, the relevancy sometimes is just completely gone. So, like, the last Bandai Premium one that they did that was pretty big was the Heroine set. And it had some BT17 cards before BT17 came out, but because of how long it takes to print and make those and ship them out and all that, we're going to be obviously getting it after BT17. And, that's like, okay, cool. I understand why they did that, but the cards that they picked weren't necessarily the greatest of reprints anyway.
Well, and if you're taking that approach of like hand picking reprints for these, special premium products, you have to. A lot of times, I imagine you have to pick cards that you know are going to generate interest with people. Yes, a lot of times you might be able to pull people in with like the art being the interest. I know with the Magic Secret Lairs, they do a whole freaking host of different like themes with how they do the art for a secret lair. So it's like, hey, we're going to give you 5 cards. They're all going to be geared around this theme. But even within inside that theme, there's usually some cards that generate some interest, and people are like, I'd really like that card. But I guess in my mind, those premium ones aren't necessarily people saying, hey, I really need this card because it's, I need it for my deck or it's a staple. Those premium ones are more of a, hey, I like this card. I think the art is cool. I'd like to have it. Do I intend to use it? Maybe. Is it the full intention on why I'm getting it? Probably not. But on the topic of like a full reprint set like Digimon did, labeling it as a premium product seems kind of outlandish, but it sounds like there was some other nonsense that kind of got wrapped up into that. But
Yeah,
when
that was a whole hell in a handbasket of a situation. I was rewatching my documentary on it, and I think I did a pretty good job on explaining what happened. It's just unfortunate that we're actually now seeing that it was a damaging set for the game. And that was like the big first, reprint set Digimon has ever done. Personally, I'm okay with the idea of just, have reprints be in the sets or in starter decks. And we don't necessarily need a hardcore reprint set. I would like one every now and then, but it has to be done very tastefully. And Bandai just completely dropped the ball the one time they actually tried to do it.
Well, and on the topic of being a full reprint set, you also have to take into consideration, I mean, obviously the premium aspect and price raise is obviously going to turn some people off. But I mean, you have to have, if it's going to be a reprint set, there has to be enough interest in what's being reprinted to draw people to say, hey, I want to buy this because there's enough stuff in here for me to want to invest into this product. If there's not enough of that, then obviously you're not going to get the buy-in. And I would imagine what probably happened with Bandai is they released it, they probably saw the numbers and saw how poor the sales were with it, the metrics were terrible, and they're probably like, yeah, no, never again. We're not doing this.
The set from Bandai's perspective sold fine. They already made their money because they forced stores to buy in before the set actually is printed, because that's just how they do it. So they already got all of the stores' money. The stores were just burnt because, like what you were saying, nobody actually wanted the reprinted cards. Like, so it was like 90% reprints with like 10% of new cards that we actually wanted. Even though we knew the new cards had very little meta relevancy, because they were being released way too late compared to when they were in Japan. But it's the fact that like you get a card like Magna Angemon from BT1 that was like a really highly sought after card because it didn't have a reprint. Then in a Bandai Premium product, it got a reprint, which brought the price of the card down, and then it was reprinted again in the Resurgence booster, the reprint set, and that solidified that this card wasn't really going to be worth anything anymore. Which, while that's cool, it made a card accessible. It wasn't from a value perspective because they ruined the own value because of a previous reprint that they just did because of how Bandai Premium works. And they specifically, for Resurgence Booster, targeted the early sets to try to get some of those cards more in fluctuation. But because this, like, the way Digimon is designed is on a soft rotation, it just didn't matter. Like, none of the cards actually saw much play. I think, like, one of the best cards that got reprinted were in some of the higher rarity slots. So it's just like, oh, it would have been nice to have better access at that card if it wasn't being diluted by other stuff that we just didn't care or didn't want. So it created a really toxic product to open because you were borderline guaranteed to lose on that set. And that's what made it a really bad set. And then after that set, stores just said, oh, this did real bad. Digimon's probably not in a good spot. Let's stop supporting the game as much. And now we're feeling the ramifications of that damage with stuff like BT16, where that was a really hot set that nobody had because nobody bought it because stores were burnt on Resurgence Booster.
Right, and that was kind of the point that I was trying to get to. Bandai didn't necessarily lose money on the set, but they put out a lot of ill will with the stores, and the stores having that ill will from that set screwed Bandai over on future releases because it's like, well, you made us buy all of this product, it didn't sell worth crap. Obviously there's something wrong. We're not going to buy into the product as much.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't help that we also had BT15 have a card get banned and limited right before the set even released. So that also really hurt not really consumer confidence because we all like praised the decision. We just knew it would hurt store confidence in in Digimon as a product because they're banning a card, one of the best cards from the set that's not even out. Why are people going to be buying this set then? And it, shocker, didn't exactly sell that great either, which again, we're still going to be seeing the ramifications of the damage between those two decisions probably throughout the rest of the year, going into next year, which is going to be the unification year. So we might start to get some recovery in Special Booster 2.0 and 2.5, but I'm still kind of expecting like the game to be in a really rocky state until that point. In terms of like store confidence in the game, I think the game is still good. It has some questionable design decisions, but that's not the topic. Reprints is the topic.
Right. So would you, I guess as a question, would you be more in favor of Digimon taking more of the Magic approach where they kind of sprinkle in reprints as the sets come out? Or what do you think would be their best approach to handling reprints? Because it seems like what they're doing right now it's not really hitting home.
No, because they had two Bandai Premium products. People are now just starting to get them, which was the Diaboromon product, and it was the O2 Adventure movie product for the beginning promotion stuff. And those are really good Bandai Premium products, but the way they released them in terms of the timing was absolutely awful. So, like, we knew that the O2 cards, just as an example, they were going to be getting a reprint. So, you kind of had to, like, gamble to see if that type of a product was worth it because the cards were super expensive when they first released because nobody had them because it was a movie promo. And the movie was a limited time thing, and then stores got basically the leftovers from the movies, so there just was not enough floating around, which made them really expensive. So it was just a huge gamble to see if that Bandai Premium product was worth it. And the same thing with Diaboromon. With Diaboromon Ace, it's just like we know Diaboromon's going to be getting some support. Are they even going to be using the Ace? Like, there was just a lot of unknowns, and it was a huge gamble, but because Bandai, being Bandai, was absolutely really crap at it, the Diaboromon one turned out to be one of the best ones because the main card of that set, which was Diaboromon Ace, he didn't get his due diligence reprint. Yet, in that same promo pack that Diaboromon Ace was from, we got the Rust Tyrannomon Ace as an event promo as a participation prize. So it's just like you have these two polar ends where it's just like they give us the cards in really weird ways. And the ones that players actually want, they just can't get. And that it's really sad and funny at the same time. But in terms of actually answering your question, I think honestly, EX sets is their best place to do reprints. Right now, EX sets are like what, 73 cards, and a normal base set is 105, something around those numbers. So why can't they just say, hey, we're gonna put 30 reprints into a EX set to flesh it out to be the same size as a full booster? Like, I honestly don't understand why they just don't do that, because EX sets sell terribly every single time, most of the time, because they're smaller sets, so it's easier to pull cards, therefore not as much value.
So your thinking would be diluting the card pools so that they can try to push more of the product, or
Yeah, like, so just as an example, you have EX6, which is basically like a heaven versus hell type thing. So you have angels versus demons. Why couldn't they, just as an example, instead of like having two, so they actually upped the amount of super rares per set as of block 3, which was BT 14 through like BT 17. um so they upped the number of supers to make the pull rates even harder for any given super rare. So they used to be 10 super rares, now we're up to 12. Why couldn't they just reprint 2 super rares, keep the 10 new designs, and you still have that same level of dilution while giving us cards that we probably would consider wanting? Um, so that's, and it's not really diluting the card pool that much. Uh, I mean, granted, 30% of a set dedicated to reprints is a lot, but if the majority of it like is spaced out properly in terms of the rarity distributions, I don't necessarily think it would be that bad. I really don't. Like, cut the amount of alt arts down, or give us reprints of specific alt arts. Like, there's so many things that they could do with the extra slot, but as like, I hate the current size of EX sets because they just, small sets just have a harder time selling. In It's just usually a known fact. In terms of the amount of cards, I was kind of like following again back to my Force of Will roots. They had a set that was incredibly small, tried to sell it as a full booster, and it backfired and damaged the game. And I'm not saying EX sets are doing that. They kind of are, but they're kind of not at the same time. But I would like sets to be full all the time. I don't like smaller sets.
well, and from the perspective, as I understand it, EX sets generally aren't running your like super valuable staples as well. Most of those are going to come from the mainline sets, so it's not like you're dumping tons of money into the EX set. Like, oh, I need 4 playsets of these, or I need a playset of these 4 cards. On I'm just going to have to flush a ton of money, which if that were the case, then yeah, EX sets are definitely for your casual player, because then you're getting your bang for your buck. You don't have to pull as many packs to hopefully get everything that you need. But
No, and that is definitely true because EX sets most of the time are also lower in power level. So to me, it just makes more perfect sense. So as I was kind of saying before with the BT3 Ludamon, we had a whole new wave of Legend Arms support, a new Ragnarlordmon, and all that jazz. That would have been an absolutely fantastic time to just reprint that card. And that card was like what, a common or an uncommon? So was it really going to hurt the card pool that much? Probably not. Again, if they just take the same ratios that they have been using and they just applied basically the filler cards to some of the reprints that are on theme with what the set is trying to push, I think that would be better. Like it just makes more sense to me to reprint it that way. And then obviously reprinting in starter decks is always a good thing. Like just give me good cards in starter decks because that makes the starter decks interesting. And that's what Yu-Gi-Oh does a lot. Is what I noticed is they'll reprint like some really good cards in starter decks and then that drives the starter deck to actually hold some level of interest that makes people want to get it. Like I have a Salamangreat deck, and it came from the starter deck because that gave me Ash Blossom, which at the time was like a $10-$20 card. It's obviously not that price now because like Yu-Gi-Oh tends to reprint their cards a lot. In terms of some of them, so like Access Code Talker just got like a big reprint, and he was a $20 card that is now a $2 card. So it goes to show like a good reprint really can help make cards more accessible, which makes the game more accessible, which makes people want to get into the game more. And that's like the big thing on reprints in my perspective. And the fact that Digimon does reprints so poorly is just really sad in my perspective. Because right now they're doing reprints in like limited time boosters, which is basically promos 2.0, and I hate it. I hate it.
all right, so to switch gears a little bit, just for food for thought, just to kind of see where we land on this one. What is your thoughts on absolutely pretty much foregoing reprints in favor of simply just essentially making the reprint a power curve spike? So just for a little context on where this thought came from, I was thinking of back when we played Hearthstone and how there was this god tier 3-drop called Magma Rager. Wonderful five attack, 1 health card. Anybody would love to play this card until they run into a mage. I don't remember the exact set that the card came out,
Oh,
but I
Ice Rager?
remember, yep, they released Ice Rager, who is a 5 attack, 2 health, 3-drop, who is literally just Magma Rager properly balanced so he didn't just absolutely get crushed by the most basic of things and actually make the card somewhat playable. Obviously, Hearthstone had the advantage in this instance of they didn't have to make a brand new card to make this change. Being a digital game, they easily could have just said, hey, we're going to just retcon these stats and we're going to change them. Can't really necessarily do that so easily in a physical card game, but what would your feelings be on that approach in a card game where we're quote unquote giving you a reprint, but the card that we're giving you is technically a power increased version, or maybe like a corrected, like better version of the card than what was originally printed?
I think I'm not against those types of reprints. I would probably label those as like soft reprints because the power dynamic of a game from when it starts to where it currently would be really only goes up. So a card like a uh, a Magma Rager, the extra 1 health that it got still kind of didn't exactly matter in terms of making that card a more desirable card to have. I mean, it did help in certain situations, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, it was still just so below the power curve that the bump didn't exactly was make it more meaningful. So it really just depends on the type of card that they want to do. This is why like most games are kind of phasing out vanilla cards because and they're starting to label them, at least the Magic term is like French vanilla, where it's just like, okay, the card will just always have a keyword. So Biomon, just as an example, is a better version of Monmon. So Monmon was a card from like the first set. It was like the first rookie blocker, and it didn't have any inheritable, and it costed 4 to hard play. Biomon, meanwhile, just is another vanilla blocker that's, I guess French vanilla blocker that also has the inheritable of jamming. So not only is it fulfilling the same role, it's fulfilling the same role but better. So like Digimon already kind of does it, and I'm not opposed to when they do it because again, Digimon being a legacy type game, there's a lot of different factors that could suddenly make a card more desirable, like its trait, its name, and its typing. Also, its stat line, depending on what you're actually looking for. Because there's a lot of very interesting combos and interactions based on those different elements that the card is playing around with. And as we're seeing right now, the more and more they try to play in the generic territory is the more dangerous things tend to get. So it really just depends on what they're trying to do and what they're trying to gain out of it.
Well, and you could very easily run into, if you're looking at like name specific stuff, they might do like a soft reprint, give you a better card, but certain cards might be kind of name locked. So it's like, well, this card is obviously better than this card. I just can't run it because this card is name locked to this card, and this card does not have the same name. Therefore, yeah, you could consider it a soft reprint, but in certain instances, it's not playable. I'm just kind of thinking of an instance in Vanguard. I know when I was playing Bruce, there was a card that specifically you had to have the grade 3 Vanguard because it specifically called out its name. Card was ungodly good. But then they came out with grade 4, and the grade 4 Bruce did not have this. Obviously, he didn't have the exact same name, and he didn't have any text that said it's treated as the same name. I know some of those cards do exist. So then the question became is like, well, crap, is grade 4 Bruce good enough to run and get rid of this grade 2 who just absolutely mollywops stuff? Or do I stay at grade 3 to continue using this card that's just really good, but then I'm losing out on all of this other stuff that requires, the grade 4 one?
Yeah, those are very interesting questions to try to ponder to see if those types of soft reprints are worthwhile. Most of the time, games don't even think about soft reprints because they're usually, again, on like the cards that are below the power curve. Or they're just trying to make something thematic and try to fit abilities to try to help shore up what those weaknesses are. Like Blue with Biomon having blocker, you don't exactly have a whole lot of defensive tools in Blue, so now here's a good generic one that you could use, and then it also has an aggressive application to it based on the evolution line that it's referencing. So I really like the fact that Digimon does a lot of like references when it comes to how they're designing their cards. It really is nice, but as reprints go, there's a lot of different factors in play, and I think like what Bandai currently is doing isn't necessarily enough in my perspective because they're really only doing reprints in like 3 ways. One is Bandai Premium. 2 is they'll occasionally throw it inside of a starter deck, which we barely get starter decks as is, and that's a problem in of itself. Or 3, it's a promo. It's an alt art promo. And usually when they do promos, it's going to be either a store promo or like it's some sort of event promo. They haven't really done a whole lot of like buy a box promos. And when they did, they've done them so poorly that like it makes the cards very hard to get, and then that's what's making us demand the reprints. So like half of the reprint problem is literally on Bandai's own hands because of how bad they are at distributing cards, more specifically promos. But again, that type of artificial demand that they can control and create is what makes like pricing sometimes actually really good. So it's just like when you get a highly demanded reprint as a promo in a participation pack, now you want to participate. It's the same type of tactic that my old boss from when I was working on Argent Saga was trying to do. He was trying to, he called it the Crush Card virus approach, which is obviously from Yu-Gi-Oh!, where there was a Yu-Gi-Oh card called Crush Card Virus, and it was literally a like meta-defining card that you can only get for winning a tournament, which was incredibly stupid on Yu-Gi-Oh's part for doing that. Then my boss was just like, oh, that creates the artificial demand for that card. Let me try to do that, and then I'll sell them the reprint later. It's just my boss was very impatient, and the game wasn't doing super well, so he reprinted cards way too quickly. And that's where like reprints can actually become somewhat problematic, is when you're trying to push these types of reprints, they can actually end up backfiring and create anti-demand, because now you just don't want the card and you're seeing it way too often. And if that's supposed to be something special and it no longer is special, then what are you really doing with it? Or what's its whole purpose?
Topic of anti-demand, like kind of things that the game can do that turns players off from wanting to get specific cards. Because I certainly felt that when I was playing Standard and Theros and ran into Mono Black rats all the time. It's just like, nothing makes me want to not buy, like, ever see these cards ever in my life than just constantly seeing them and knowing that they're going to beat me to death.
Yeah, and right now Magic's like doing, in my perspective, way too many reprints, which is good for the game because their most popular format is Commander, and that's a legacy-based game. But at the same time, where all of their money is in the alt arts. Like, they realized alt art cards is where the money actually is at, not in like actually having good designed cards. I mean, you'll still get good designed cards that are like, or I guess good in terms of power, like high powered cards. You'll still get some of those being really expensive, but a lot of like the good cards, they tend to try to reprint in alt arts to try to create more demand for it. So like Bloomborough, just as an example, just had Jace the Mind Sculptor. Jace the Mind Sculptor, like 5-10 years ago, was like $100 card because of how strong that card was and its overall meta relevancy and impact. Well, as they kept reprinting the card, it slowly whittled down its price. It was actually higher than $100. When I got mine, it was around $100. And now they have a new printing of it, and it's like $20. But the special art version of it is $300. So the functionality of the card is the exact same. It's just the art that's different. That's creating the demand.
Magic looked at all of the Japanese card games and just like, what are they doing right? Look at all these alt arts. Everyone's going crazy over them. Look how much sealed product they're opening. Dang, we could do that so easily.
I mean, that's Pokemon's claim to fame. Like, a single Pokemon card that's good and meta playable will have literally like 4 different arts of it. You'll have like their base art, then you'll have like a weird posed static background art that's has a nice foiling to it. Then you'll have like the actual alt art. And then maybe you'll also have like a rainbow version of the card. Like, usually a good Pokemon card will have like 3 to 4 different versions of the card, which again is like contributing to why Pokemon's price makes it the most accessible card game probably out of every card game on the market. Like, you could build a competitive Pokemon deck for $60. I can no longer say you could build a competitive Digimon deck for $60. You used to be able to, but that's when distribution was better. That's when acquisition was better. Like being able to acquire cards. Like that's when Digimon was in a probably not so greedy state and a little bit of a healthier state. Meta competitiveness aside, like I do think it was just easier to be able to get the cards before Block 3 started.
Well, and on the topic of alt arts, you could probably do an entire like podcast episode on how different tactics can be used in order to help move the sealed product, because that's literally a very strong reason on why the alt arts and whatnot exist. But I just lost my train of thought. I don't remember where I was going to go with that.
Yeah. But you also have to make the alt art matter because Digimon, unfortunately, they don't necessarily do the best of job when it comes to like these event card alt arts. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they just don't. So I hate it when they just do we'll have the same card, let's just replace the background. And make it even less interesting than an actual arted background because usually it's like some generic design with the colors of the card slapped behind it, and it's so ugly and uninteresting, and Bandai for whatever reason loves doing it, and I hate it. I think it's the dumbest thing that they could do when it comes to reprinting cards. It's cool that they are willing to reprint certain cards. Like just as an example, we already got the an update pack for the cards that are going to be in EX6 or not EX7 as a store event pack. So it's nice that we're getting these cards before the EX set comes out, so that way we're ready for using the cards in the EX set when it comes out. But at the same time, we also, based on Japanese data, know in LM4 for Japan, they're getting reprints, which means we're eventually going to get reprints of them, which means that their overall demand is just less because we already know of the reprints while we're getting the card. So it just boggles my mind. That's probably why Bandai wants to do unification. There's a lot of reasons why Bandai would want to do unification, is so that that type of stuff doesn't happen as often. And I think unification definitely has more appeal to it from a business perspective in terms of like just what it can do to a game. And I think reprinting is definitely a part of that equation because now we don't have that foresight, at least in the English side of things, to know when a reprint is coming. Like we already know that Shine Greymon Ruin Mode, Death Exmon, some of the big like heavy hitter cards, they're getting reprints. Heck, even Protoform is getting reprinted as an event pack card for tournaments, which is a really good reprint, which makes me want to play in tournaments when I already have my invite and I realistically don't need to play in any more tournaments. But because the pricing is good, I want to play because I need those cards. And right now, some of them are just harder to get. And I think like this is like, as much as it sucks seeing SRs just become harder and harder to get, like, if Bandai is willing to put those SRs in places where you could actually get them and have a better chance at getting them, and it drives the price of them down, I'm okay with it. Like, 12 SRs suck, but if they're good enough on their reprint game, which I don't trust them to be, it definitely can at least soften the blow.
So you're definitely making a case for Bandai doing things right, where they're doing the exact same thing that you said your old boss did of, oh hey, we'll just make the pricing the reprints, and we're gonna make that stuff like super fire because that'll get tournament turnout, or it'll get more turnout than it probably naturally would. I guess I would say.
Yeah, the only difference is my boss was designing cards with that purpose in mind. Bandai is not.
Right.
So Bandai is just, these are just happy accidents. Like, Bandai has basically a running list of cards players want and good cards that are in the meta. They I would be shocked if they didn't have a running list of it because they're really good at making sure to reprint good cards most of the time. It's just they're bad at when and where they're placing them, which is the most infuriating part because they could either make it completely irrelevant or they can make it the most in demand thing since sliced bread.
Hey, as long as they do better than Magic when God, I can't even think of what the name of the set was, but it was the set where they literally like, oh hey, we're gonna reprint all of these old cards from the alpha and beta and all these really old sets, and oh hey, do you want a Black Lotus? We're gonna reprint that.
Oh,
It
Magic
doesn't. It
30.
does.
Yeah.
Yeah, Magic 30. I mean, we're not. We don't even care what the name is at this point because it's such an atrocious money grab. But what have you, whatnot. But basically, they just like we're just gonna reprint all of these highly sought after cards. We're gonna hit the reserve list, a list that they have literally stated is we are never going to reprint these cards. They go ahead and do it anyway, and everyone asks like, "Hey, can we use these cards like legally in like tournaments or any of that?" And they're just like, "Nah, these cards aren't legal to use." And it's like, then why are you printing them? I mean, yeah, it's cool to have it, but it's like I have a printer at home.
Well,
I can print a proxy and just like glue it over top of something, guys. It's about the same thing.
well, Bandai only does that with demo decks. Sometimes they'll make demo deck cards not actually real legal cards to use. Sometimes they will, but we've had examples where they just for whatever reason don't. And Bandai being a Japanese game, especially with Bandai trying to play things as safe as they humanly possibly can, they also don't like doing reruns. Like that's why we got a resurgence booster is because like hey, they wanted to very obviously do reprints of older cards to make them more accessible, meta relevancy aside, just because some people were still complaining that they couldn't get some of the early booster boxes or like some of those early cards. And like if they were to do a second resurgence booster, it probably would continue the trend and they would take cards from block 1. And then if we get a third, it would take cards from block 2. I don't know how often they want to do that. But they also have to do it in a very tasteful manner because the way they did it the first time was just, it was a very half baked. And we definitely can tell that the pie was half baked and it was not a good pie.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you have to have those failures in order to learn from them, and then I mean, obviously, it's going to create a little bit of bad will, but as long as you are able to show the players that you are trying to move it in the right direction, I don't think it's necessarily a end of the world thing if they don't nail it on the first try. But I mean, after like two or three, if the problems that have been pointed out since the first set are still apparent, then you really have to start questioning like, what kind of design decisions are they doing that they're not really resolving anything. They're not fixing any of the problems that we're pointing out. Why do they keep making quote unquote bad product?
Right, and I think that's kind of where EX sets kind of fell for a minute, where it's just like EX 1 through 4 were just completely awful sets. There was like barely anything relevant in any of those sets on their release. They'll have like a handful of couple of cards and maybe one deck you could start to make out of it be relevant. And then all of a sudden we get EX5 and 6, and then they start being absolute home runs in terms of like, hey, the decks might not be the best, but they're at least competitive enough, and like they're actually insanely to the point where sometimes they're actually insanely strong and meta defining, which was absolutely unheard of before EX5. But back to like the whole reprint thing, I think like Bandai very clearly has an issue with reprinting cards. They're not afraid to reprint cards. They just have an issue on how to reprint cards. And this goes back to like the whole idea on how Bandai just as a company does not know how to sell their products. And it's really unfortunate to say that because as a person who loves Bandai products, knowing that they can't sell it efficiently to me really kind of sucks. Because right now, like part of this whole reprint thing started with a conversation between me and my brother where he's just like, hey, I would love to play Diaboromon, but I don't want to pay for Diaboromon Ace. It sucks that I missed the Bandai Premium products to have easier access at Diaboromon Ace. So am I just like SOL? And I kind of just stared at him and I told him, yeah, you're either going to have to make a bad version of the deck or you just don't play the deck, period. And like at that point, like right now, we're having a really bad issue when it comes to casual versus competitive and the price point of each of them. It's actually still cheaper to play competitively than it is casually. Like I'm looking at the prices of all of these casual cards and it's like they all need promos that are all insanely expensive, that are more expensive than the casual card or the competitive cards. So it's like, why would I ever build a casual deck when for the same amount of effort I could just build a competitive one? Like it doesn't make sense to me. And that's the whole point on why they need to reprint cards more, because they had an issue, like again, going back into why Resurgence Booster existed, they knew they had an issue reprinting cards and getting them to be accessible for players. So they just temporarily banned certain cards, and then part of the reason why the Resurgence Booster existed was because it was a way to reprint the cards and actually distribute them. Like, I don't see that as a problem. They're trying different ways to accomplish the same thing, but they just need to do a better job at it, to be honest. Like, give us literally a promo booster. We have over 100 promos. Give us a booster with a whole bunch of promos. I do not care. Just
It sounds like these casual players aren't playing casual enough.
no, they're not spending enough, and that's the real thing. Like, it's just silly on where the game has gotten and the reprints that Bandai has chosen. Like, you look at a game like Pokemon, and they're not afraid to reprint cards either. Like, you see a card like Professor's Research everywhere. That card's a meta-defining staple card. Like, it's usually at least a 1 to 2 of in every single deck. And that card is highly accessible. Going all the way back from like the beginning of the game, technically it was Professor Oak's research, but they obviously kind of did what you did. Just, hey, we need an updated version for this new iteration of the game to make it more on par with what we're currently doing. Even though it does the exact same thing, they added the support tag to it because of the supporter rule. And it still does the same thing. Discard your hand, draw 7. Very good card. But Pokemon has made sure those types of cards are relatively accessible because they know those cards are the lifeblood of the game, on top of just having a metric butt ton of alt arts and various other methods that they've done to decrease the price of their cards.
Well, and on the topic of Pokemon, not being afraid to do reprints, Pokemon's also not afraid to just completely do a rerun of entire sets. I mean, a buddy of mine who is really big into selling Pokemon cards, I'd have to go back and look at what set it was, but I remember he messaged me. He's like, "Oh yeah, Pokemon's just going to do a complete rerun of the set. The set is literally not even like 2 years old, and they're just going to do a full rerun. Obviously, probably not. They're not going to produce as much as they did in the original set. Maybe, maybe half or a specific fraction of what was originally done, but." Just like completely reprinting an entire set. No new cards being added. They just literally took what was printed in the original set and they just said, "Yep, we're gonna reprint this to X capacity. We're gonna get those cards out to the players because obviously the players really want them." Which, I mean, if you have a set that has that many cards that the players are looking for, honestly, I don't think that's a terrible idea.
No, so this goes into like a rerun of a set, I think is like fine. Bandai really doesn't want to do it unless they're like forced to. So they were forced to for Special Booster 1.0 and 1.5 because they literally just didn't print enough. Bandai does this all the time for all of their games. They just don't print enough of the first few sets, and because they don't know the overall impact and demand those first few sets will have. And now One Piece is getting that same treatment where, oh, we are now just getting reruns of the first three starter decks. That's crazy. Like, they're already 2 years into their game, and we're just getting a rerun of their first couple starter decks. It's weird, but then again, you get like what Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh have done, where they will do a rerun of older sets. Magic has kind of done this too. They've combined them more so for draft purposes, but they will be like, yeah, here's a set remastered, basically. Like, here's base set remastered. Here's Time Spiral remastered. Here's Legend of Blue Eyes remastered. And it's cool that companies have different ways to be able to do that, even if they know the cards might not hold relevancy. They're trying to cash in on like nostalgia-ness. Granted, Digimon's not big enough for that. Neither is One Piece. But it's interesting on reruns versus like remastered sets versus reruns versus reprints. Because to me, like Modern Masters, that's like a reprint set. Resurgence Booster, that's like a reprint set. Them just saying, hey, we need to print more of like Special Booster 1.0, even though we're currently printing something else. That's something a little bit different in my perspective. But it's cool that companies have all these different ways to be able to get cards into the player's hands. And it's just picking what is the most efficient and effective way for what they're trying to gain out of the concept of reprinting.
Yeah, and I would completely agree to that because what works for one game may not necessarily work for another game. I mean, you definitely have different sides to the extremes because I know in Weiss a set almost never will see a reprint. I know that's more so due to like licensing and well, if we only have the license for so long and it expires and it's like do we really want to pay to have that license back to do the reprints because we don't actually own, we don't actually own the property kind of thing. Then you have the other ends of the extremes where it's like, yeah, we're just gonna Magic, where it's like, yep, every single set, at least 25% of every single card that goes into this set is going to be a reprint of some kind. And by God, we'll have some sets that are literally just reruns or remasters, where it's literally we're not hardly adding like I don't know, maybe 5% new cards or zero. I mean, it all depends. And it's all just going to be reprints. We're just going to take what was there and we're just going to rerun it and we're just going to hope it does good.
Yeah, with Magic for the more highly valuable stuff, they tend to do like masterpieces or special guest cards to try to make them more special of a thing to get, even though it is still just a reprint. But even then, I wouldn't mind seeing, like, Digimon has tried that in like BT11, where it's just like, yeah, here's some reprinted cards. They're in alt art and foil, and they're just thrown into booster packs. It's just, again, how Bandai executed that is what made it terrible. So, like, they just... I don't know. It's so weird. This is why I think Bandai just can't sell stuff, is because they have such great ideas, but just such awful execution. And, like, we're almost a year out from Resurgence Booster, or at a year out from Resurgence Booster as of the recording of this episode. And it doesn't look like we're actually going to be getting another dedicated reprint set like Resurgence Booster. And if we are, it's definitely not on the near horizon. So it'll be interesting to see how Bandai chooses to try to do reprints, if they're even going to try to improve their reprints at all.
So it sounds like Bandai is a firm believer in the sounds good on paper, bad in practice.
Yeah. Well, no, it's good in paper and it's good in practice. They just can't. They just don't practice enough to know how to be good at it.
So they're the random person that you find at the tournament. You're just like, hey, here's a brand new deck. Good luck. And the person doesn't even look at the deck, and it's like, oh, well, I have no idea how to play yellow control. This isn't going to go well.
Right. It's like some people will just pick it up immediately because of their native talent, and then other people will be like, I don't know what I'm doing here. All these cards look good, but I don't know the sequence in which I need to play them. And then others are just rock stars. I'm not saying other companies are rock stars at their reprint. Obviously, certain games, depending on what iteration of the game they're on, or like what the game is trying to do and accomplish. Because I know that Flesh and Blood has tried a couple of different ways to do reprints to some success. Like each company has their own different approach, and we're just trying to highlight some of the tools that companies have been employing to get reprints out in a more meaningful way. And like honestly, the way that Pokemon and Magic and kind of Yu-Gi-Oh, the way they do some of their reprints in terms of just putting them inside of the set seems to be honestly the best and most logical way, instead of trying to hide them behind promos and events and all that stuff and make it extra challenging to be able to get these cards. And that's like the Bandai issue on why Bandai's known for being absolute dog crap when it comes to promos and reprints. Is because they try to do these not necessarily undermined tactics, it's just they undermine themselves because of how they're doing it. So, but yeah, reprints is definitely a very interesting thing. I'm curious to see when unification happens, what's going to happen with reprints. Do you have any other closing statements on reprints, Mark?
No, I think in the grand scheme of things, reprints are definitely a good thing because, I mean, eh, as somebody who may not have been there at the opening of the gates, like your brother, and he just missed out on the opportunity. It's like, well, I'd really like to build this deck, but I wasn't there when this dropped, so I'm just going to pay through the nose, or I'm just not going to do it at all. The concept of reprints to me is to kind of keep that availability around, so you don't have to be somebody who's been in the game for, I know Digimon's not that old, but like say Magic, you haven't been in the game for the last 20 years. You don't have all these really old cards, but it gives that opportunity to the players coming in. It's like, oh, these are really cool like cards or really cool ideas, and I would like to have those. I really don't want to pay $50 plus a card because it was only ever printed in this one set. So I like the concept of reprints. I do think it needs to have a good balance where you're doing enough of them that it feels like it's meaningful, but you're not overdoing it where it's like I don't feel like I'm getting enough new cards, or the cards that are being reprinted, there's just an ungodly amount of them, and it's like I don't know if I necessarily need my 60th copy of this card. It's been reprinted in like every other set.
Yeah, and there's definitely a lot of Digimon cards that need constant reprints. And Bandai just is not willing to give reprints at all. Like, it's so funny. Some of the more meta defining cards, they just don't want to give us reprints of. And then cards that are, like, less relevant, they will be perfectly happy and content with giving us a reprint of. And it's just really weird on what they're choosing, when they're choosing it, how they're choosing to release it, and like they don't have to be. Like I don't necessarily think this is that complicated, but I guess according to Bandai it kind of is. I think learning from what other games can do can help elevate what your game is trying to do. And it's so funny to see Bandai would rather just reinvent the wheel and fail because they decided to invent a square instead of a circle for their car, than learn from what other mistakes people have already made and try to improve upon the foundations that, you don't even have to bother trying to remake. But that's just Bandai being Bandai at this point, and that's why, like, again, I just don't think Bandai knows how to sell things. which is very sad considering I like what Bandai produces. So hopefully Bandai might actually take not necessarily some of this advice, but just take the inspirations from others to elevate what their game is doing, because I think there's a lot that they could learn from. And that's why I always like your insight and perspective, Mark, is because you, like me, have played a plethora of card games and are very knowledgeable in just the trading card sphere because of the amount of games that we've played and or made.
Oh yeah, it's always helpful to have a plethora of knowledge when it comes to this because, like we said, every company does it a little bit differently, and what works for one necessarily might not work for the other. And there's also different avenues. I mean, that's kind of where I brought up the Hearthstone question of, as you elegantly pointed it, it's essentially like a soft reprint where you're not just reprinting this card straight, you're making some changes to it, possibly reevaluating where it falls on the curve, but essentially it's a reprint nonetheless because you could easily say, "Oh yeah, this is literally just this card, just changed a little bit."
And Bandai definitely has done that. Like Floodgates is definitely an area where we've seen plenty of like reprints where it's just like, oh yeah, this is just the same card as that, just in a different color and like small tweaks. And there still isn't a parody on all of the Floodgates for all of the colors, which to me is absolutely hilarious and sad again at the same point. But yeah, Bandai definitely could improve in their reprint department, and hopefully they do improve in their reprint department to try to make the game more accessible for all, which, if anyone knows me, I'm a huge advocate for accessibility. Like, I don't necessarily care about the value. I'll still spend $100 a booster box, even if I'm not getting my $100 in return, just because the game can be accessible if I do. It's kind of like a whole like shared pool thing where it's like if everyone contributes, then we all win. Um, it doesn't exactly work out that way in real life, but that's the mentality I like to think. So I think this was a good discussion, and it definitely seems like a good opportunity to wrap things up. So, at this point, thank you, Mark, for coming back on. It's always a pleasure to see your perspective and opinions on all of these like more broad and grand topics.
Anytime, anytime.
And with that, I also want to take this time to thank all of you, the listeners and or watchers. And if you enjoyed this episode and want to help support the podcast, please make sure to also share it with others on social media so that way you can try to spread and, get the word out that I do this and, it's kind of cool that this is done. So thank you all again, and we will see you next time.